Hi all. I'm going to take this video to go over what is literacy for this class, expand perhaps some of your ideas about literacy, and briefly go over Project 1. So the goal here is to complicate some of your understandings of literacy, to look at a few examples and discuss them, and connect all of this to Project 1, which is your literacy narrative. So traditional definitions of literacy are reading and writing. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. But as literacy scholars and compositionists see literacy as much more than just reading or writing. It's any kind of specific knowledge that relates to a specific subject. So when you think about your literacy narrative, you're free to write about your experiences with reading and writing if you want to do that. But there's also a lot of leeway you have in defining what you consider to be a literacy. So for example, these are all kinds of literacies that you could write about if you wanted to. Sports, the sciences, fan fiction, music, coding, video games, etc. If there's something that you do that requires a specific set of knowledge, a specific skill set, you can essentially define it as a literacy. So if you learned music at a young age, or recently if you learned how to play the guitar or something, that is a type of literacy that you're learning and that you could certainly write about when it comes to Project 1. Also think about what you do for work. Like working retail entails a specific kind of literacy, right? You have to deal with customers in a specific way. You kind of have to understand how customers think. You have to understand the layout of the store and where things are. You have to understand how to work cash registers and things like that. There's a specific set of skills, knowledge that makes you literate in that practice. So another example, sports. I didn't really play sports too much. I grew up skateboarding, but I can definitely view skateboarding as a type of literacy that I became very fluent in. If you ever listen to two skateboarders talk about skateboarding, you'll have absolutely no idea what they are talking about. But they do, because they became fluent with that language, with those terms, and how skateboarding works. Same thing with like sciences or math. Math is certainly a kind of literacy. If you're really good at math or you like math, you can certainly write about how you learned math, your experiences with math, and frame it as a literacy. Another good example is cooking or food literacy. Those are kind of slightly two different things. Food literacy would be like your understanding of how food affects the body. Maybe you have a really good understanding of how a food affects the body and what it does. Or maybe you bake. Baking is a specific kind of literacy, one that you could write about for Project 1. As are video games. Understanding how video games work is a specific kind of literacy. Same thing with fashion. So I encourage you, when you have your conference with me next week, to think about some expanded literacies that you have and that you might want to write about. As I said, you're free to write about traditional literacy, reading and writing if you want. But I encourage you to expand a little bit. And the readings for this week, especially learning to serve, will really help you understand waiting tables or serving as a kind of literacy. It would be a really good source for you to use in some way, shape, or form. I'm also going to upload some recommended readings that you can use for sources or to support your ideas. One is about sponsors of literacy, and one is a student essay coaches can read too, about how sports coaches encompass their own literacy and use specific kinds of literacies. So in thinking directly about Project 1, I have a list of questions here that you can start to think about in terms of getting yourself going for Project 1. You'll probably want to figure out whether you fall in here or in here. And also note, if you do fall within this traditional literacy, like you want to look at your experiences with reading and writing, they don't have to be positive experiences. Maybe you really don't like reading and writing, and you can trace that back to some experiences you had with instructors, with parents, etc., with learning, reading, and writing. You can kind of write an anti-literacy narrative if you want. But that would be more along the lines of you answering questions here. If you wanted to go with an expanded literacy, that would be, like fashion, sports, sciences, something like that. These are some questions you might want to ask yourself. And some of these questions overlap with the assignment prompt itself. But this is up on Canvas for you to access, and I encourage you to kind of use these questions when you're drafting your outline / brainstorm for our conference, just to kind of get you thinking, and so that the more you have for your conference, the better. Okay, I want to briefly go over the literacy narrative and what you need to do. So first, you can see I was just talking about like what counts as a literacy and how all these other things count as a literacy. So this project asks you to create a piece of writing about your experiences with some kind of literacy. Do note that if you do an expanded literacy, you will have to take some time to situate it and define it as a literacy. You'll have some sources that will help you to do that, but there are also plenty of sources you'll be able to find, or I can help you find. Again, don't feel like you need to focus on traditional literacy. You can certainly expand that out. So you're going to craft a piece of writing that explores this literacy and how it's important to you. So ultimately, you are making an argument about literacy, that traditional literacy has affected you X, Y, and Z ways, or that X is a literacy and it has affected you X, Y, and Z ways. Ultimately here, you're creating a narrative, something that incorporates a story in some way, shape, or form about your experiences with a literacy. So you're kind of combining narrative and argument, and the more I talk about writing, the more you'll see that that's kind of how writing works. There are lots of different ways to approach writing, but they often blend things like narrative and argumentation. So ultimately, you will be making an argument that incorporates your anecdotes and experiences with some kind of literacy. You're going to need to take some time to define literacy, read some articles and opinions about it. I will, as I said, upload the additional reading resources in this module, and Learning to Serve should be really helpful to you. Also, if you go in your textbook and you go to the index and you look at literacy, that should give you some examples as well to use. So here are some things you're going to want to do and consider in this project. You need to have a clear controlling idea, which I'll talk with all of you during our one-on-one conference about. I think defining literacy will really be important. You're going to have to use evidence to support your ideas. This should come from personal experiences, articles, readings, and anecdotes, maybe from other people. You're going to want to choose a specific audience who you want to read this. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in week 2 module. And you're also going to want to have a cohesive structure, try to say something insightful, and taking some time to talk about why your ideas are important. Like, who needs to read this? Who needs to understand that X is a literacy? Or who needs to understand that your experiences with literacy were problematic because of X, Y, and Z? Really think about the audience that you want to read this. That audience is not me, for example. You want to think of a specific audience that you are targeting your ideas for. Down here are some more questions to ask yourself. This overlaps a little bit with this, but the more you have, the better, I figure. The final product should be a minimum 4 double-spaced pages. You need to use at least 4 sources, MLA format, works cited, relatively few grammar issues, all that. Your outline for your conference is due a week from today. Your first draft is due the 14th, and the final is due the 21st. So I would look over all of this in helping you craft your brainstormer outline. And please let me know if you have any questions, concerns. If there's anything that I can clarify, you can message me on Slack, on Canvas, or through email.